Both of them are talking today about gaming and the use of gaming in learning. So we have a theme presentation going. Without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Carrie and we'll get started.
All right, so as you can see, I have prepared a lovely PowerPoint presentation, but we're a small enough group that we don't necessarily have to stick to that format. So I tend to much prefer not to hear myself talk for long periods of time. So I would love to generate actually some discussion about what it is that we're doing and how it all works and that sort of thing. What I've started to notice in my students, and as kind of someone on the cusp between Gen X and Gen Y, is that more and more technology is playing a role in how students spend their time outside of school. There's research that says that as of a few years back, students entering college have spent more time playing video games than they have reading prior to coming to college. So gaming really is a technology that I think has a lot of potential to be harnessed for lots of different fields. And I mean, we've got two very different fields that are being represented even today in our discussion. But something that really piqued my interest is this idea of how do you develop skill, especially clinical skill. And that's something that there are ongoing debates just even how to do it in formal education, much less utilizing technology. So it's an interesting blend that I think has a lot of potential. So my layout was just to spend a moment kind of touching base on what is game and then what is serious gaming, and then to talk a little bit about the pedagogy and the pedagogical foundation that the Suicide Risk Assessment Game, or SRAG, which is a horrible acronym, but what we're using for now. And then what I really wanted to do is spend a little bit of time kind of demonstrating at least pieces of it, and then getting you guys' feedback. I'm in the throes of IRB processes for getting the evaluation stage going, so I don't have hard data to show you at this point, but that's definitely in the works. So just for a minute, think of your favorite game. It doesn't have to be a video game. It can be any format. And just kind of think about what you like about it, what keeps you playing. And then I want you to kind of spin that and say, what have you learned from it? And it doesn't have to be formal academic learning, but what do you learn as you're playing this game? And I'm hoping that someone will maybe give an example of your favorite game and what you've learned from it.
Well, I could, if you don't mind, if I...
Absolutely.
Years ago, I used to love to play Microsoft Flight Simulator, which is kind of a game. It's a simulator, but it's kind of a game.
Absolutely.
I played a lot of Microsoft Flight Simulator, always kind of wishing I could gain access to a real airplane. One day I bought an ultralight airplane because I had enjoyed flying, digital virtual flying, and I was going to take lessons and learn to fly the airplane. Well, one day I was taxiing the airplane, and a gust of wind came and blew me into the air. I taxied too fast. And so I started flying. And immediately I started thinking, I think I've done this before, somewhere. And
that's a great story.
I decided I was going to fly around for a half hour before I crashed the thing. At least get a half hour of enjoyment out of my investment. And but then eventually, just using the skills that I had learned from Flight Simulator, I managed to get it back down on the ground.
So a very real example of how skill transfer can occur between
I learned something
between technology and real life. Other examples of favorite game and what you might have learned from it.
My favorite game right now is Wii table tennis. And I don't know that I may have learned a lot from this game other than I've learned a lot about how to give English to a ping pong ball, even though it's all being done virtually.
Yes, my spin on the bowling ball and virtual Wii is fantastic. I don't know that it would translate quite as well to a bowling alley, but so those are some great electronic examples. And even if you think about the example up on the PowerPoint, chess, think of all the strategy and all of the kind of the process and the details, and how do you outsmart someone, and how do you how do you anticipate a move and how that might lead? Think of all of those types of cognitive development that can come from playing games. So, got a lovely definition of game up here, and essentially, it's described as voluntary activity, which is going to be a slight departure from the serious gaming that we're talking about again, because if you assign it as a homework assignment, it's no longer truly voluntary. But players can enter this sort of imaginary world that's separate from reality, and whether it's like the massive online role-playing games where there really is kind of a separate identity, or getting lost in kind of the world of, or getting flow from playing, euchre or backgammon or any of those sorts of things that people get very involved in, it really takes you apart from real life, and you enter this different space where you're using different skills. Typically, entertainment is the primary focus. Mm-hmm.
Can you define flow? Does that have a definition?
Yes, it does.
I thought it did, yeah.
Basically, flow is the best way that I can describe it. I don't have the technical definition off the top. Is a place where you're really so involved in something that you kind of lose time. So if you think about kids at my husband, playing Wii, you can sit down and, minutes turn into hours because they're so involved and so enraptured by what you have in front of you that you lose time and space. And anyone who's a binge writer among us, or does any activity like that, once you get to a place where time sort of, you don't notice it passing. That's my best example of how you would get a sense of flow, but there's some great research on it. Serious gaming, then, is a game that's designed specifically around learning outcomes for the process of teaching. So, that idea of it being voluntary may not apply quite so well, but the rest of it really should. And even talking to folks who are developing educational games, they talk about it really does need to be fun and it needs to be engaging. Otherwise, you don't have some of those same concepts there. When we talk about serious gaming, it's not the edutainment that we all saw in the 90s. I was a big fan of Oregon Trail, and I can tell you that what I learned is that there are some places that you can't ford a river, and that may have been part of the history that was designed for it, but I learned that I needed to shoot the buffalo because it was too hard to shoot the squirrels, and I only had limited ammunition, and that you could only shoot really one because you didn't want to waste ammunition because you could only carry 200 pounds back to the wagon. Were those things that game really was trying to teach? Probably not. No, I think it was. Well, but I mean, it was designed around being, at least my understanding, was to teach students about the history of the Oregon Trail and this whole process. And as I was playing it, that's not necessarily the information that I got. But these are designed to be instructor-led and built around specific learning objectives. My field is counselor education. A branch of that is school counseling. So I speak from school counseling, but also from a counselor education standpoint, and really looking about how serious gaming can be built on strong pedagogical theory is a really important thing. You don't want to do something just because it's kind of neat and trendy and like, oh, let's use the technology and see where it goes. It's going to be better and more appropriate to design it based on strong pedagogical theory. So what I was looking at is trying to find a way where my students could demonstrate their knowledge about a skill that I needed to be able to, if only for accreditation purposes, much less the ethical sort of implications of it. I wanted to be able to demonstrate that they knew what they were doing before I let them loose in a public school. Serious gaming also allows for failure without real life repercussions. And the game that I've designed is based on suicide risk assessment. So, we really and truly are talking about a life and death sort of circumstance. So how can I have my students take the information that I give them as far as how do you identify a student at risk? How do you assess them for risk? What do you do with that information? They can repeat that to me when they're in the class and I say, okay, how do you say this? And they can say it back, but you put them in the middle of school where they've got 50 other things going on, a caseload of 600 students, and say, how do you do this in the moment? And their default may not be what I taught them in class. Their default may be, something far different from that could actually put a child's life kind of on the line. So And that's a little overdramatic, but it's not really too far from reality. So really I looked at constructivism and problem-based learning, and I can sort of skim through these slides. Looked at motivation and how that can play in. So, you know, the concept of beating the clock, like that's a great hook for a game. Like, how do I've got this amount of time, how can I make sure that I finish it before that time period? Okay, so I talked about suicide prevention and assessment in a school setting, and really what this does is it takes the information that I teach them in class and it tries to put it in a semi-realistic setting. So they're no longer sitting in my class and doing it hypothetically on a vignette that I've given them. They're playing a character, they're playing themselves in this game where they are going into a high school as a school counseling intern. And because they're the intern, they've been given 5 students. And there's information that's been found that one of these students is at risk and is planning on attempting suicide Friday at 5 p.m. And now it's Monday at 8 a.m. So we've already introduced, like, you've got a little bit of time, but not a whole lot. And there are all of these other things that you need to get done between now and then. There are some people that will help you, there are some people who will not. You can't just go and pull the students out because you need to find some sort of information first. So it really is teaching not only, how do you apply the skills, but how do you work with the stakeholders in the school in order to be able to triage. So the essential purpose of this is that at the end of the game, I want them to identify the student who is at risk. And I also want them to identify a secondary student who they need to sort of keep an eye on. The other 3 students have a variety of issues, but are not at any sort of immediate threat. So there's not only this idea of how do you assess, there's also this whole overlay of the culture of the school. So there are a lot of random assignments as far as teacher personalities. Each teacher has 3 different characteristics that is randomly assigned at the beginning of each time the game is played. One of them is based on how much information they figure out about us, like how much information they know about students. The second is how relevant that they feel like that information is to give to you. And the third is how helpful they'll be if you ask them to take over a non-counseling task. One of the things that school counselors run into in the field is that there are lots of things on our plate that are not effective uses of our time and our skill. So things like assigning lockers, or lunch duty and hall duty are great and you can have contact with students, but at the same time, a lot of times there are other things that need to be done, scheduling. All of those tasks, there are sometimes other people in the school who could take over some of those things.
Other being department.
Very similar. That same sort of organizational setting. There are always those tasks that we don't necessarily need to do, but that somebody needs to cover. So one of the options in this game is that you can ask a teacher to cover for you some of these things, with the hope that they'll be able to synthesize all this material and they'll kind of tap those higher level application skills. So a little bit about the timeline. Bill will remember our lovely trip to Finland. That trip, I actually had the opportunity to interact with some folks at the Agora Center, and they were doing a lot of serious game design, and actually I was able to talk to them and help them out with a career counseling game that they were working on. And so on that plane ride back, I had a lot of time because I'm horrible at sleeping on planes. I was like, I wonder, this is really neat. I wonder what I could do with this. And my interest is in crisis intervention, crisis prevention in the school environment. So I started to kind of, think about that. And then, happenstance is that Bill Watson joined the faculty and offered, was it EBCI 591U or something like that, where it was a serious game development for education. So I audited that class, and through that class, worked with the framework he developed to put together a design document and test out a paper sort of prototype of one of the parts of the game. At the same time, I put in an application for the TLT, Digital Content Development Grants, and was able to get $15,000 through them to help implement this game. So from the summer of 2008 until actually last month, we've worked on multiple iterations of getting this game up and running. So now I've got a playable prototype that is pretty solid. And so now I'm entering into the stage of, getting more qualitative and quantitative data on whether or not this actually, hits the learning objectives it was designed around and how effective it is as far as teaching and reinforcing those skills. It's actually a nice dovetail with NCATE and CAPE. CAPE is our accreditation body. And
Great name.
oh, it's an awful name. But they have moved in their new standards to really saying not only do you need to demonstrate that this knowledge is delivered, you really need to be able to show us that they can do these skills. And so I've actually had a couple members of faculty at other universities who are excited to get their hands on this to be able to demonstrate that their students can apply the skills that they have. So, any questions up to that point? So I know I've blown through a lot of material.
Talk about the, how did you develop it? Did you mod it? Did you hire out coding? What was the?
I am not a coder. So what happened was the bulk of that grant went back to TLT for their student development team to put it together. So actually everything that you see, I developed the content for, but undergraduate students at Purdue did all of the graphics, did all of the coding, and all of that sort of thing. And I would come in and meet with them periodically and give them my feedback and listen to their thoughts as far as, well, this doesn't work quite like this. How about if you do this instead? I'm like, oh, that's brilliant. So mostly students at Purdue. It does have the capability to save, which is great. So students don't need to complete it all in one sitting. The whole thing really takes, I had my students last semester try it out, and some finished it as quickly as about 10 minutes, and there are others who took really about 45. So it seemed like the majority was falling kind of between that, 20-minute, 25-minute mark. But once you know what you're looking for and how to navigate the system, it gets easier. So each subsequent play seemed to take less time. So again, the slightly contrived, there's been a note found that indicates that someone is planning on attempting suicide at the end of the week, and we've narrowed it down to these 5 choices. So we have a lot of instructions embedded in the welcome. So you're going to be able to navigate around the school and talk to teachers, like I said. Some of the teachers know the students better than others, so part of, again, learning to navigate a school is learning the personalities of the teachers. And what I was wanting to be really careful of is not to accidentally teach them that science teachers are less approachable or that English teachers always have the answers or any of those sorts of things. So that's part of why the randomization is built in. Now you can also observe students, and sometimes the information that you get from observations is helpful and sometimes it's not. And again, that's something that is randomly assigned throughout the game as well. And sometimes you'll be walking and find something in the hall or in the bathroom, just a note that says either information that's helpful or information that is not for the case. You have a planner. As I said, it's not the only task that you need to do by the end of the week, and there are repercussions if you do not complete tasks on your planner. This is where there's a slight departure from reality, because honestly, if you've got a parent phone call that needs to be made, does it need to be made from 2 to 2:15, or could it be pushed to 2:30? Yeah, it could probably be shifted around somewhat, and these calendar points and times are fixed. But if you don't do it, then there's a logical consequence based on what you missed. So if you missed a principal's meeting, you're going to get yanked into the principal's office. And the principal is going to meet with you for longer, and he's going to set up another meeting on your planner. If you miss a student group, then you have to call down every single student from that group, explain what happened, and set up a different time. All of those sorts of things. And there are other consequences built into the assessment as well.
Carrie, are those consequences in terms of losing experience points, or how are they consequences?
The consequences are really a reduction of time right now. We do have some that are tied, at the end of the game you get a GPA, and you need to have a B or better in order to pass your internship. So if you do it wrong enough times, it'll start deducting from your GPA as well. But I don't have a score basis the way that a lot of games do. Now, once you think you have enough information to go on, there's a phone on the desk. You call down the student and you can assess the student. So what I'll do is I'll show you the navigation of the school, and then I'll just call down a student to show you a little bit of that assessment piece. So the names are all randomly generated. You'll have different names. There are different student profiles that are all, again, randomized. So each time you play the game, it really is a different experience. And they'll have basic information. And part of this is sort of a red herring. The student that is at risk, it doesn't matter what their background is. So a lot of students spend a lot of time going through the cumulative folders and all of that sort of thing, and really and truly, because you can't really tell by what a student looks like so much what their risk of suicide is. That's part of what we have to sort of throw them off and be a time suck, because every time you click on it, the time advances. Time is not real time, it's game time, but every time you click on something, it advances. You'll see up here there's something that says danger signs as you travel throughout the school, and if you find something, it'll automatically populate in there. So, which is handy. So it automatically keeps track. So if you forget whether you talked about Morgan or Seth, you can go back to their file and see it. And it takes time, but so there's a map of the school, and if you float the mouse over it, it will identify what each room is if the symbol isn't clear. I think they did a pretty decent job with the symbols. Other things to keep in mind, teachers all have lunch periods. In theory, even though that doesn't necessarily always happen in the school day. So if you're talking to a teacher and it's his lunch period, the teacher will leave the room. So, and again, you don't necessarily have a schedule of all of that kind of stuff. So really figuring out, okay, it's about lunchtime, I'm not finding teachers, I need to go to the cafeteria. So those sorts of things, again, that are relatively logical and make sense, but aren't necessarily things that you would think of. So again, you can observe the classroom, you can speak with the teacher, or you can leave the classroom. If you observe, is that helpful? Yeah, not particularly. Whereas this one might be a little bit more helpful. So again, is it something that's definitely the student who's at risk? No, but it's something to keep an eye on. And you can also speak with the teacher to either ask about a student or ask a favor. If you were to ask a student, we can ask about Carla. She hasn't noticed anything, which means that the random kind of roll of the dice that it is, she's not going to disclose any of the information that she has. If you ask a favor, it will automatically populate all of the non-counseling related duties that are there. And so you can click on one of those and say, I want you to take a lunch duty. She doesn't have, so now I don't have to do it anymore, which is great. So you see how that works. Again, this is a random event, it's one of those kind of graffiti pieces. This won't always pop up when you have there, but this is one that has relevant information. And again, it's a different student than the one that we just had heard about, the graphic drawing.
And how did you get to that?
It'll randomly pop up from time to time in when you're in the hallways or when you're in the restroom.
Okay.
So it doesn't. These happen maybe once or twice a game, and it just happened to happen earlier this time. So if we were to go and look at the planner, you'll see that there are all sorts of tasks. The green means that a teacher has taken it from you. It will be blue if you've completed it, and it will be red if you've missed it. So again, that will automatically update. It's got all sorts of fun things on there, from hall monitoring to individual counseling, PSAT meetings, IEP meetings. My favorite, and I don't think it's populated on this one, is that sticking stickers on ISEP booklets. And those are things that I hear from my students that are very realistic. So that's a little bit about how to kind of navigate the school system. Let's say that I've identified Morgan. So I'm going to call her down to do a risk assessment. Again, there are going to be a couple choices. Some of them are better than others. So let's say that I just start asking questions as opposed to introduce myself and do kind of informed consent. So, and let's say that I'm just, I'm going to get to the point. I'm just going to ask her if she's thinking about contemplating suicide. So I ask her the question, what do you assume her response is going to be? It's going to be a good one or a bad one? Probably not the best way to go. So, again, it tells them exactly what they did wrong, forgot to build rapport with the student. A parent phoned the principal who insists that you call her back, that you drop everything and make it better. So, again, you've got a significant amount of time that passed, and she's no longer in your office, so you got to call her down again. And she's upset that she has to come here again. So I'm going to learn better, and I'm going to introduce myself and my role. And so and it also gives wording that's appropriate for a lot of these things, which is great because a lot of times there are students who are like, how do I talk about suicide with the student? How do I ask them, what does that look like? How do I talk about confidentiality? And it gives them a place to sort of play with the words and see something that, it may not be perfect for every style, but that will work and tends to be relatively smooth. She does change her expressions from time to time, which is great. So I'm going to ask her how she's doing. Life just sucks. A really common response is to reassure people, oh, it'll be better, whatever. That's not the thing that we're trying to teach our students to do. So, so again, there will be a penalty imposed. So
if you had clicked on reassure, there would have been a penalty imposed?
Yeah, and I don't know whether she would have left the office per se, but she'll probably come back with some sort of snappy retort like, you have no idea what my life is like, so leave me alone, something like that. But I want to get to, okay. So this is our suicidal student. None of the other students will go, some of them will give, if they are the second tier student, then they'll give some sort of vague response, and if they're normal students, they'll be like, oh, I've had a hard week, but I can handle it, that sort of thing. So, and again, we're trying to teach them to ask directly as opposed to indirectly. So that's a common misconception that, you should kind of talk, well, have you ever thought about hurting yourself? And if they say yes, what do you know?
They've thought about hurting themselves.
They've thought about hurting themselves. What does that mean? They could be cutting, they could be, burning, they could be doing all sorts of things. It doesn't mean that they're suicidal. Because they could say no, be suicidal, and be thinking that, if they kill themselves, then they won't be in pain anymore. So it's actually not hurting themselves, it's making them feel better. So that's another kind of checkpoint. And again, you've got some example of wording there. Okay, so maybe this is the second tier student. Thought about it once or twice, but I wouldn't kill myself. Okay, so what suicide risk is she? I think that she's moderate but not imminent. And again, this is overly simplified, and all of this is meant to be implemented with the course instructor so that you can process all of these things. So, you do safety planning, send her back to class, and she's someone that you need to follow up with. And the game prompts that you haven't found the correct one yet. But if you go to her file, you'll see that danger sign is populated. So that's kind of how it's played, and I know that I'm about to the time that Phil gets to come up, but no, that's quite all right. But I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have. I've got obviously a copy of this up in my office if anyone wants to look into it any further. Excited about gearing up for the evaluation. But I think it's not something that's designed to be used in absence of a professor who can process the information with the student, talk through, okay, what would you have done with a second tier student? They're not the imminent risk, but what do you do with that? Like someone who's got a history of suicide attempts and says that they're not going to kill themselves. Do you believe them? Do you talk? How do you do all of those things? So yes.
Well, certainly a timely topic, no doubt. Do you see the application of this being for a counselor at a secondary level versus a counselor at the elementary level?
I think that this has potential for expansion in different settings, not even just to school counselors. I think that there's relevance of this for teachers and for principals and for paraprofessionals. And I think that the options as far as how do we gear this type of thing to other populations is huge. Suicide risk happens at the elementary level too. It happens at the middle school level. I focused it more on a kind of secondary setting because that's a lot of times where you have higher numbers, higher frequency, but when you're talking about ages 10 through 24, it's still the second or third leading cause of death. So, and I've worked with suicidal kids who are 4. So, you know, it definitely is a conversation we need to be having at all levels. But in particular for the prototype, I chose high school because in a typical high school classroom, you're going to have 3 students who have attempted suicide in the previous year, according to statistics. So,
do you see any application to be able to use with parents?
Absolutely. I think that this is a conversation that we need to have at multiple levels. You know, not to scare people, but just to say this is what you look for, and if you see this, here's what you do. Because I think people don't talk about suicide because they're afraid if you talk about it, it'll put the idea in a kid's head or a parent's head or somebody's head. Where actually the research says the opposite. That, you know, if you talk to them about it, then they feel less isolated, feel less alone, and are more likely to say, okay, they understand how much pain I'm in. I can talk to them about it. So yeah, I think that, you know, and granted, this is my bias because it's my research interest in my background, but I think this is a conversation that everyone needs to have, especially if you're in some sort of student services or working with people, workplace too. Suicide is a huge issue with the geriatric population as well. So it's not just limited to young.
I just attended Jim Gilligan's presentation, and we reached exactly the same conclusion that all pre-service teachers really need to be talking about the fact that there'll be counseling, whether or not that, you know, somebody's designated them as counselor.
Yes.
And I think any of us who taught know that.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So I think this is way cool.
Thank you.
And I love that you're modeling language because sometimes that, you know, finding that phrase is ideal. And it can be used over and over again. And, you know, I always tell my student teachers, you hear a phrase that really resonates with you, it works with the kids, it might have a little bit of a humorous edge, but it gets the job done. Yeah. Write it down.
Absolutely.
Start using it. And I love that you're modeling language.
Thank you.
A couple of comments after following up on what you said. We've talked about doing something for the College of Education because I feel very unprepared to deal with several issues that have come up. So
yes.
I think this would be something that I would do.
Yes. Well, and I mean, and just as an aside, I'm trained in a program called Safe Talk to be a Safe Talk trainer, and it's a 3-hour, very standardized, where it's just how do you have the conversation. It's not even how do you intervene. It's how do you have the how do you identify, how do you have the conversation, how do you link that individual to somebody else. So, I mean, our counseling and development program is a great resource for people who have questions about any of this sort of thing. But if you have students that you're interested in having educated about that sort of information, look me up.
I've got several questions, but these are for Phil too, and he hasn't presented yet, so that I'll see these. Maybe this will come up in his presentation as well. It seems to me, I mean, I'm sitting here thinking about, Jim will remember when there was a lot of interest in expert systems. The idea was that you would download the knowledge that somebody had, you would build decision trees. So if so-and-so, then this, and if such and such, then that. And I don't know where that went. It kind of fizzled out in education. And the problem with simulations, as you mentioned earlier, is the students very well may not understand the assumptions underlying the simulation. Sherry Turkle talks about watching a kid play SimCity, and She said, so why are you doing this? And the girl said, I don't know, I've just learned that if you raise taxes, riots break out. So.
Not far off, actually, from the Tea Party.
Not far off. But here's the point, and maybe Phil will address this as well. It seems to me that the content, what I know about suicide and as a counselor, how I react to it, content that's embedded in the game could also be covered in a lecture and a chapter that they read.
Yes.
It probably should be.
Yeah.
And well, that's where I was going.
Yes.
That's where I'm going, because in the old days, or maybe in the current days, reading the chapter and hearing the lecture is pretty well what we do with content.
Mm-hmm.
And this is a chance to hear the lecture, read the material, and then
Practice.
use it.
Practice on your own, and then come back in and talk about that practice. And that's every bit as important as the playing the game in general. Again, this hasn't been tested enough to know that I've been able to identify all of the different things that they might learn that I don't want them to learn or that I don't mean them to learn, because they all learn how to system.
And I'm
That's the downside.
gonna take advantage of that I'm stepping to the podium to ask one more question. That is, have you vetted this with outside experts in terms of the content here happens to deal with how to speak to students about suicide, how to recognize ideation, and so on and so forth? And have you had?
It's been through an initial kind of, that basic overlay,
Right.
where I've got a couple colleagues who also have a background in crisis intervention. They went through and helped me tweak language and some of those pieces of
Sure.
the game. So yes, but before it would go to any sort of mass marketing,
Right.
it would need to very much be. But before I even go that far, I want to see what the learning
Absolutely.
that occurs is. Thank you, and I will.
All right.